Well, thank you very much. As she said, I will try to keep my talk short because it's very late. I'm hungry too, so I will try to be as fast as possible. Having said that, the good news is that if you would like to know a little bit more of what I will present today, this afternoon is planned a seminar, and so everyone who would like to participate is very welcome to spend an hour this afternoon trying to understand better this approach. So, having said that, the idea that I'd like to present is quite a radical one, and it has to do with the nature of conscious experience. And I must say that to my chagrin, is a purely physicalist idea, is a strictly physicalist hypothesis about the nature of conscious experience. And my premises are that consciousness is a real phenomenon, and I will talk mostly about conscious perception, and that if it is real, it has to be physical, and that everything which is physical is spatio-temporally located, and it is more or less made of matter and energy. So I'm not a physicist, I'm an engineer by background, so I am maybe very simple in my premises, but I take that consciousness, whatever it is, it must be something in the physical world. So, where and what consciousness might be then? There's a long tradition that try to locate consciousness in the brain. This is a very strong assumption that many people take for granted, in the brain or in the body or somewhere in the central nervous system. And people have been looking for phenomena that might look like one's conscious experience. However, so far, nobody has been able to find anything which is intelligibly like one's conscious experience. If I look inside the brain, I found many interesting phenomena, but nothing that looks like my experience of, say, a red apple when I look at the red apple. This is a big problem, because when I want to find out whether a phenomenon is like another phenomenon, I need to find out identical properties between such phenomena. And this, so far, has not happened when people compared one's experience of a red apple, which is red, round, and appleish, so to speak, and what's going on in the brain. In the first half and in the second half of the 20th century, it was very popular, the mind-body identity theory. So different authors suggested that maybe a correct materialist theory of the mind should have been able to locate inside the brain something that was just our conscious experience. David Armstrong famously argued in favor of that, and other people, for example, J.J.C. Smart, they said, why should not sensation just be brain processes? And this was a perfectly acceptable scientific hypothesis. We have a phenomenon that we are not able to explain and to locate, and then we find for something physical that should be just the phenomenon that we try to explain. So far, this effort has not been very successful. In the brain, we don't find anything that looks like one's experience. And then we have this strange idea that basically the world is colorless, is soundless, is tasteless, and that all such properties are somehow created in the brain. But in the brain, they are invisible. Nobody is able to see our experiences looking at the brain. And that is strange, because it is the only phenomenon that it is invisible, that we assume that it has to be in the brain, but at the same time, it is invisible to direct observation. And I must also say that the brain, no matter how complex, is just yet another object. It is incredibly complex, I admit that, but it is a piece of matter and energy. So why should the brain be able to produce anything different from what other objects are able to produce? So this is where I think that maybe all such approaches that are always trying to put consciousness at the very end of a very complex set of phenomena may have started with the wrong foot. And then I ask you to take into consideration a completely different angle, completely different approach. Why should we restrict the physical only to the neural? Why whenever someone declares to be a materialist, we take that the mind has to be only in the brain, and why the brain should be the only object that we have to take into consideration? So, classical mind-body identity theories were based on two premises. The first is that if consciousness is real, it has to be physical. And I buy it. I accept that. I share such a premise. But then they somehow implicitly also assume that if consciousness is physical, it has to be somehow in the brain. It has to be neural. And I challenge the second premise. And I suggest the mind-object identity theory. So, I say, I keep the first premise, if consciousness is real, it has to be physical, and then I say, why consciousness should not be identical rather than with the brain, with the external object itself. Now, let's consider for a moment what it happens when I have an experience of a red apple. Well, my experience is very much like an apple. I have an experience, and I experience red. I experience something round and something applish. Something that is very much like this object that I keep in my mind. This is the object that has all the properties that I attribute to my experience. It has all the properties that I find in my own experience. So, basically, this is the basic idea that I would try to put to test, which is an empirical hypothesis. It might be wrong, but it is an empirical hypothesis, just like looking for consciousness inside the brain. The brain is a piece of matter, the apple, the object, is another piece of matter. The hypothesis is that the conscious experience of an object is identical to the object that one experiences. So, let's confront again the two competing theories. On one side, we have brain-bound. The experience of an object is a neural process in the brain. This is my hypothesis. Object-bound. The experience of an object is the object, is the red, round, and shiny apple. Well, very roughly, the brain doesn't look like my experience. The apple looks very much like my experience. So, just to make it clear, there are several, just to place this hypothesis in the theoretical landscape. A lot of people are looking for the phenomenon of consciousness inside the brain. Dualists, since it is very difficult to find anything in the brain that looks like conscious experience, they suggested to put conscious experience in some completely independent domain. Other people, like an activist, like certain stripes of externalists, suggested to look for the interaction between the body and the object, or to the process that takes place between the body and the brain. But once again, such a process, such spreading activity between the body and the brain doesn't have the right properties. I don't have time now to consider this theory, but I'm just mentioning that the properties of the process are not like the properties of one's experience. And finally, this is the hypothesis that I am presenting to you today, namely that one's experience is all the object. It's not in the object. It is the object. So, if we consider nature from a physical perspective, everything takes place somewhere in space and time. So we have basically two objects. One is the object we experience, the apple. The other one is the brain, or the body. They are separate both in time and space, but they are causally interacting. And then we have something else, which is our own experience of the object. And we don't know where to place it. And we've been looking for such an experience in the body. I suspect that the main reason behind the hard problem is that we've been looking for the properties of the external object inside the property brain, inside the property which is the brain. Since in such an object we don't find anything like our experience of the external world, anything like, I would say, the external world, we drew the conclusion that such properties were not physical, or if they were physical, they were somehow spatial or phenomenal, like qualia. So I suspect that the very idea of the hard problem originated by looking for those properties inside this object. And because we couldn't find them, and we keep looking for them inside the wrong object, we developed all kind of very complicated conceptual house of cards. So the suggestion is, let's place consciousness somewhere else, but in a place which is still physical and in space and time. So that's the idea, very simple. The identity between experience and object. Now, I skip this because it will lead us because we don't have enough time, and I'm hungry too. And I would just like to mention a few objections. And I anticipate that in order to reply to the last one, which is also, in my view, the most compelling objection, you will need to come to this afternoon seminar because we won't have enough time today. But let me just address the other objection very quickly. We have a strong feeling that we are not in the object. I feel inside my body. How is it possible that I claim this crazy idea that I am the apple? This is a very strong intuition that I need to address. Then another strong objection is that, well, but the properties of the object are not like the property of my experience. The object has weight, has mass. My experience doesn't have weight or mass. Are we true of that? Let's just a moment and I will provide some reply. Finally, this symmetric objection. The object doesn't have the properties my experience has. For example, intentionality or privacy or perspectivalness, and so on. But the most apparently strong objection is the argument from illusion or the argument from hallucination, namely the fact that it seems that in many times, very often my experience is different from reality. So how can I claim that my experience is just like an external object if in many cases it doesn't seem to be any external object at all? So very quickly, first objection, I don't feel to be in the apple. I feel to be here, inside my body, and more precisely, I feel inside my head. Well, this is a very strong intuition, but many intuition in the past revealed to be completely wrong. We feel still right now here in Sigtuna, but we are just moving very fast around the sun. And about our feeling of being in the body, it is just a matter of where our sensor organs are. So basically, we don't feel to be here. We feel that our body is correctly where our body is. In the 70s, there's a famous thought experiment by Daniel Dennett. Where am I? Daniel Dennett made the hypothesis that his brain has been located elsewhere and it is kept in contact with his body through a very sophisticated Wi-Fi receiver installed inside his body. Well, if that were the case, and if we believed that our consciousness is in the brain, like more or less many people do, we would have no first-person notion of being elsewhere if our brain were elsewhere. So what I'm trying to say is that from our sensor organs, we get a notion about where our perception and therefore our body is located. But we don't get any notion, we don't get any idea about where we are. We just have an idea where our center of perceptual gravity, to borrow Daniel Dennett's words, is. So we cannot draw any conclusion from our feeling, from our commonsensical feeling of being here. I can perfectly be here, I can perfectly have the feeling of being in my body, but still the thing that it is my experience can be elsewhere. It could be elsewhere in my brain, if my brain had been located elsewhere, or it can be in the apple, if the apple is the thing that my experience is. Second objection, the object has many properties, experience does not. Thus, the object cannot be one's experience. Well, here I need to make a small revision of our notion of an object. Because very often we have a very commonsensical and I would say ideal notion of objects. We take object to be something which is independent of causal interaction. Let me just make this example. This apple has many properties. I would say the stuff that I keep in my hand right now has many properties, like neutrinos, electromagnetic fields, all kinds of stuff, infrared, ultrawave, all kinds of stuff that are not part of the apple that I experience. The apple that I experience is a subset of the stuff that I keep in my hand. So the stuff that I keep in my hand is a lot more complex than the thing that is part of my experience. What I'm trying to say is that the thing that I keep in my hands and that I experience is something that I would like to call the actual object. Not the ideal physical object of science, but just the actual object, namely the subset of the physical continuum which is able to produce effects because of my brain and because of my body. In fact, for example, visible colors is part of such an object. Infrared is not. So the idea is that the object we experience are the subset of the external world that can produce effects because of the properties, the causal properties offered by my body. And we say, well, but objects, how can we be sure that they're always there if such an object depends on the body? Well, it is a bit like the fridge light. We want to know whether the fridge light is switched on. We open the door, it is switched on. Then we close the door. You all know such an example. Well, the same happened with the actual object. The actual object, the particular subset I suggest our experience is identical with, take place every time our body interacts with a certain piece of the external world. Because of that, such a piece of external world can take place in a certain way. Which way? Like the object I experience. Therefore, I experience colors, I experience a certain shape, and I experience other properties, which are that subset of properties that can produce an effect because of the causal structure offered by my body. Neutrinos, for example, are not able to produce any effect because of my body. Therefore, they do not belong to the actual apple I keep in my hands. So what I'm trying to say is that we need to modify slightly our notion of objects. And instead of having an ideal object, we have a causal object, an actual object. Namely, the object that can take place because of my body in front of the stuff that is more or less in front of me. So basically, very quickly, 3 crosses. Are they real? Well, the first one is obviously you are all able to see it. Then, are you able to see the second cross? Yes. U and N. It's a little bit harder to see, but you can see that there's a cross. Then, can you see the third cross? Which kind of cross is that one? Primes, prime numbers. Now, you may say, well, the first cross is real, but the last one is not, because the last one requires a more complex kind of cognitive capability. But I could say, well, it's just a matter of habit, because I may envisage to build a retina, an artificial retina, which has some kind of character recognition system, instead of having black and white or gray and white color system. And such cross would be as real as the first one, as long as it finds the proper body with which to interact. So this kind of object, the actual object, takes place. And whenever there is a body that allows such an object to take place. So I like to use the analogy with relative velocity. In the past, if I asked to a physicist, is this object moving? The physicist would tell me that's a meaningless question, because in order to say whether something is moving or not, you need to tell me with respect to what system it is moving. Velocity is relative. So this apple right now is still with respect to me. It is moving at a certain speed with respect to the moon, and it is moving with a different speed with respect to the cars that are passing nearby. So this object has infinite relative speed at the same time. This is just very simple physics. Now, the idea is that the actual object is like relative velocity. The actual object is one way for a piece of reality to be relatively to a body. Is one way for a piece of reality to be in relation with an object, with a body, So this also explains why the same piece of reality might be many different actual objects, like the same object may have many different relative velocities. Third objection, and then we are getting close to the end, because I promised to stick in 20 minutes or less. Experience has many properties. The object does not. Thus, the object cannot be one's experience. Well, I would argue against this idea, because our experience is made of two different kinds of properties. One kind of properties is made by properties like red, round, appleish, tasty, this kind of stuff, which are properties that are very much close to the object. And then there's a second kind of properties, which is like intentionality, perspectivalness, aboutness, phenomenal character. And what it is interesting is that the second kind of properties is not really experienced, is not really part of our experience, but it has been invented in order to justify the separation between us and the external world. I don't have time to address all of them, but I just make one example. Intentionality. We always say that experience is the only thing in the universe that is able to be about something else. You know, intentionality is the alleged capability of experience to be of something else. I have an experience of bread. I have an experience of a house. I don't say very much, I experience a house. I say I have an experience of a house, because I assume that experience is one thing and that the house is another thing. And then I have to introduce intentionality, like Brentano did in 1874. He said, well, the hallmark of the mind is that the mind is able to be about something else. But why the mind has to be about something else? If the mind were the something else, if the mind were the external object, there would be no more need of intentionality, aboutness, and I would argue all of the other properties that we assume the experience has. So, well, I haven't addressed this, but I would just say something very quickly. Someone is claiming that the object is temporally separate from the brain. Therefore, the object cannot be my own experience. But this is an objection only if we assume that I am in the brain. Because if I am in the object, there's no time gap. I'm already there. So it's like the spatial gap. Someone could say, well, I cannot be in the apple because there's space between my body and the apple. But I say, well, if I am the apple, there's no space between myself and the apple. The problem doesn't even, cannot even be addressed in a way. And moreover, the fact that there's a temporal gap is not only, it would not only be a problem for this hypothesis, but it would be a problem for all physical phenomena. Even between the spikes in a neural activity, in a neural processes, there is a time gap. So that's not a problem for me, but it is a general problem. I don't have time to make this example that I will like to do in the afternoon, but I cannot really get into this. And I just want to mention the last problem that I would like to address in the afternoon for everyone who is interested. This is the strongest objection to this theory, I believe. What does it happen when one hallucinates an apple? Because I believe that there aren't many strong objections to take the apple as a possible physical candidate for consciousness when I experience an apple and the apple is in front of me. Because in such a case, I have both the brain and the apple. And then don't really see any reason why we have to stick with the brain. And we cannot take into consideration the apple. But what about those cases in which there's no apple? In which I dream of an apple, in which I hallucinate an apple, in which I have an illusion of a color which is not there. Well, I will skip this too for reason of time. And my reply about the notion of about the argument from illusion and the argument from hallucination is pretty straightforward. They are forms of perception. Only that so far we have described them in terms of, let's say, mental imagery, of wrong mental imagery, of wrong mental appearances. How will I be able today of making such a claim? Well, I went through all the literature about hallucination, dreams, direct brain stimulation, Penfield, illusion, and in all such cases, as I will argue this afternoon, we will see that our capability, for example, to hallucinate a color is completely constrained by our previous experiences in the world. We will see that there has never been a single case of a new intrinsic phenomenal experience in one's hallucination or dreams. We will see that one's dreams are heavily constrained by one's past actual experiences. And my claim will be to show that it is possible to reduce hallucination and illusion to cases of perception. So, just to get to an end, the idea is the following, that the brain is like a dam. The body is like a dam. It is a causal condition that compels, that allows to something else, the actual object, to exist. But consciousness is the lake, it's not the dam. You can build a dam 1 mile high, the most beautiful, the most complex dam, but if there were no rain, if there were no water, you would have no experience. My point is that the brain is necessary to allow to the external world to take place in a certain way, but that consciousness is not a property of the brain, but the consciousness is identical with the external world, with the external object that takes place in a certain way. That's the basic idea that I try to present today. Thank you very much.
Let's all thank our speaker. Yes, one correction that I wanted to make was you were apologizing for being an engineer, but my gosh, thank goodness for the engineers, because that's how we keep our feet on the ground. So thank you for a very refreshing perspective. Do we have time for one question before we have John Pilotti that will speak? One, yes.
I was just wondering, I saw that you are in robotics, so does your theory have any applications in AI?
Well, it wouldn't rule out the possibility of artificial consciousness, because it would suggest that as long as a body is able to have a certain causal structure, it would allow the external world to take place in the way in which it takes place because of a human body. And in such a case, that machine, no matter whether it were made of artificial structures, it would have consciousness. But consciousness would not be a property of the internal computation. It would rather be the external world that takes place because of the causal structure of such a machine. So the application is that it is conceivable to build a conscious machine.
All right, let's thank our speaker for a great presentation. Okay.